Welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, the weekly podcast where we discuss energy, industry and politics. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Wolfe Power Club, the largest energy podcast on Apple, and what an exciting week. The energy community has come to London, and I'm very delighted to say at the official International Energy Week run by the Energy Institute, one of the keynote speakers is Mark Davis, who joins us today. Mark, welcome to the podcast.
Hello, Alex, and great to be here. Thank you.
Now, listeners, the subject we're talking about today, we've got a world-leading expert on flaring. Now, you may well have been on your own travels and seen it. It's quite an iconic image of the oil and gas industry. But ultimately, when you see flaring, we know that actually it's something that can be worked on with the industry to improve many gains and many benefits. But for our listeners, Mark, they might have seen an image of flaring, but what causes them? Why is it problematic for the environment? And how does it affect the finances in the energy sector? I appreciate a lot there, but I can imagine a lot of our listeners are flaring.
Yeah, look, it's a really good sort of opening question. So, what is flaring? Let's nail that one. I'll try to. Flaring is the deliberate burning of gas, otherwise called natural gas, which usually occurs as a byproduct of oil production. So imagine you're in the desert in North Africa, you drill a well, you find some oil, you produce the oil. Well, historically, at least historically, the gas that comes out of the solution, so when you produce the oil, you depressurize it, and gas that was in solution bubbles out. What happens? Well, if there's no pipeline, then there may be no solution. So historically, at that point, companies, operators would flare the gas. And what that means is that they basically release the gas to the atmosphere, but most importantly, they do burn it. And that's actually a lot better than just releasing it as pure gas, pure methane. So really, consider it a waste product, a byproduct of oil production. It happens in upstream facilities, but it also happens at refineries.
And Mark, in terms of the size of the problem, in terms of like the impact, I understand there were some published figures by the Financial Times, and that made your company show the actual massive, impact on the world that flaring can have. Can you just share with our listeners some of those sort of figures and overall sort of per annum challenges that the industry faces?
Yes, it really is an astonishingly large challenge. If you run the numbers, and indeed the Financial Times had a big read on this topic featuring Capterio in our work. But if you run the numbers, as the World Bank does for flaring, they are kind of the leading authority, although we work very closely with them as well. They estimate that about 150 billion cubic meters of gas is flared. Now, that sounds like a big number. Let me put it in context. It's about 4% of global gas consumption. And that means that's a pretty big number. If you think of 4%, if it was a country, flaring would be the fifth largest consumer of gas if it was a country. And then in terms of, I always like to think in other terms too. So in dollar terms, flaring is of the order of $30 billion of revenue lost. And really important, especially kind of now with the climate challenge that we also face, in emissions terms, it's about 1 billion CO2 equivalent tons per year. So we're kind of getting on to, depending on how you measure it, 1 to 2% of emissions, 4% of all gas. It's a big deal. And, given that there's an energy crisis, a energy security crisis, a cost of living crisis, and a climate crisis, this is not good news. But of course, by fixing flaring, we can help with each of those crises.
Now, before we understand a bit more how you guys fix flaring, some of our listeners might not understand that this part of the energy sector is actually quite complicated because when you're dealing with the assets you're talking about, just due to the financial cost of them, the investment, the nature of national government, engineering company, can you talk through some of the stakeholders that might actually be involved in both the ownership and operating of these assets? Because it's not straightforward that you're just talking to one ops manager at one company.
You're quite right. It's a complicated ecosystem. And pretty much in all countries, the oil and gas industry starts with the government. So, the government has control over the licenses that they award. So these are the areas of land or sea that are awarded to companies. Now, those licenses are awarded to companies, and they can either be so-called independent oil companies, think of super majors, BP, Shell, Exxon, Total, or they can be smaller players that are still listed, or they can be unlisted privately held companies, or they can be national oil companies. So those are the types of companies that get involved in terms of the operations of the oil field. But what's really important here to understand is that no company operates alone. It's very rare that they operate alone. Most fields, most assets are operated in a partnership. And so there'll be multiple different equity partners. An international oil company will partner with a national oil company, for example, and there'll be multiple partners, and there'll be multiple decision-making bodies involved in executing that asset. And that's a really important element of the industry. Actually, it's a really good element of the industry because historically it means that the best practices are shared around. If a leading super major has the best technology, then the way to get it into a North African country is to partner with a national oil company and then make sure that the information and the best practices are shared. But of course, it does, as I think we'll get onto, it does have complications for how this works.
So a bit like myself, Mark, you sort of started your career at the majors. You had various things, and if people look at your LinkedIn, they can see some fantastic work you did before moving and forming your own firm, sort of 6 or 7 years ago. But can you tell, since you formed the firm, I understand that you guys have I mean, you showed it to me last week. It looked fantastic. You guys have got a product called FlareIntel. How does this actually solve flaring, other than it does look spectacular on screen, guys?
It does, and thank you for that. The flaring data is really critical to driving the conversation on. And what we do at Capterio is, as you say, we have developed a product called FlareIntel. What we do is we take data that was originally used to track weather, that's taken by satellites, publicly available satellites run by the US government, NASA and NOAA. And we take this raw data and we process it through a rather complicated algorithm in real time to basically find the hotspots. The hotspots that we measure literally, we're measuring temperature, we're measuring heat from the burning of the gas. And we find those hotspots over, to add a bit of science, over multiple wavelengths of infrared light. And we run some complicated mathematics, and we compute the volume of every flare. And what's really, really cool about this is that there are multiple satellites flying around the Earth multiple times per day. And it basically means that we guarantee to get at least one detection, usually 3 or 4 detections per asset per day. So we can actually see the flaring at every single asset in every country, for every company, every day. It's unrivaled, unparalleled visibility. And really, action starts when you have data. And until we have data, which is now, of course, we aren't necessarily empowered to act, but now we have it, we can.
So that leads nicely then, in terms of environmental concerns and being International Energy Week, we'll have a lot of the nation's governments represented in some form at the Energy Institute this week and in Westminster. But Can you tell me some government-led initiatives around the world that are focused on flaring? And if I understand correctly, there's some quite recent trade deals where flaring is part of the relationship between two nations.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. In fact, just before I answer that, maybe I can just set the scene by giving you the league table of where flaring happens. It's kind of one of the really interesting things. Um, and at number one is Russia. Number two is Iran. Number three, Iraq. Interestingly, given the list I've just given you, number four is United States, followed by Venezuela, Algeria, Libya, Nigeria, Mexico, and Saudi Arabia. So, those, if you think of where are the big challenges, I've probably given you the top 6 or 8 countries that are at least half the problem. But another way of looking at it is to think about what we call the flaring intensity. So, how much flaring is there per unit of oil production? And if you look at that metric, then number one is Venezuela. That was in my first list. Number two is Algeria. Then there's Iran, Libya, Iraq, etc. So, oh, Turkmenistan's up there as well. So it just gives you a flavor for how international this is, which is, of course, why it's great that this is getting some focus at International Energy Week. As you say, there are leaders from, companies and governments around the world here in London this week discussing, amongst other things, how do we reduce emissions, how do we improve energy security, etc. And of course, flaring is part of this.
Because it sounds like a bit like some other areas we cover on this energy podcast, that there's great sort of commitment, but there's also a bit of a thing in the back of the mind. Well, what actually happens if we miss a 2030 or 2035? So in terms of like on the ground commitment, is there any sort of regulation that you would like to see that potentially, sort of the work you guys do and the work of other stakeholders in this could actually sort of deliver on some of the big commitment? But we also know there's that voice in the back of the mind, but what happens if it's not met? And I think, as you already said, it would be in its own right one of the biggest gas oil producers if it was circled out as an individual sort of country or customer.
Yes, just to restate what we just got to a minute ago is commitments are great. You need commitments, you need ambition, but they are just not enough. I was in a meeting with the head of the IEA who said commitments are great, but we need action, guys. Come on. Um, so you have to have the commitment to set the scene. But I would say on your piece about how do we sort of move from commitment to action, the first piece is data, because if you make a commitment, then unless there is some way of demonstrating progress on that commitment, unless there's credible data, which of course now we have with in part through Capterio, it doesn't necessarily mean that much. So data is kind of key, but equally, regulation is really key. We've got to get the incentives right. And honestly, the more I think about this, it's easy and a bit cheap to blame the oil and gas producers. Yes, they are accountable. Yes, they must reduce their emissions, but governments have a really important role to play here. Governments need to set the framework so that companies can act within that framework and deliver on the expectations that society has. So here, in the context of gas flaring, it's about setting the rules. It's about having a very clear policy on flaring. It's about having penalties for companies that flare. It's about enforcing those penalties. Many countries have penalties, but they're just not enforced, and therefore they don't really count too much. It's about unlocking red tape, to make sure that if companies do want to do the right thing and they do want to make the investment, they can make it. But the other interesting angle, I think, is even more interesting, which is kind of the role of consumers, you and me, led by our governments and led by the companies that import our oil and gas. Here, regulation can play a key role. So, and the EU is taking the lead here, really quite proactively. By starting in 2027, if you import oil or gas, unless you can prove with credible third-party data that it has are low carbon intensity, you will have to pay essentially a penalty. And so this is actually, I think, really good because it puts the onus on the importer to assure the importer's supply chain to make sure that it's getting the right kind of oil and gas. And that actually puts more pressure on the upstream, the producers themselves, because they don't want to not be able to sell their gas or have to sell it or their oil at a discount because it has associated flaring. So, regulation in country, but also internationally, really can be driving the difference here too.
I'm fascinated about Capterio itself. So I can imagine right now there are some both majors and energy companies, and I can also imagine some civil servants and politicians from governments around the world listening to this podcast and saying, we know we've got a flaring problem. They probably know that using your technology, they can identify specifically where the problem is. But how can they sort of work with you guys to then go from problem to some solutions? Because I can imagine that the whole point of Intel is that once you've got the intelligence, there's something positive that you can do about it. I was just wondering if you could go through our listeners some of the things that can be done.
That's really, really important because, we're here to drive action. Just to expand on what we see in the data, because it's really interesting, because the data really helps that we provide, really helps drive three things. Number one, really helps drive visibility so you get an awareness of how big the problem is. Number two, it helps you to drive operational excellence. And I'll come back to that in a second. And number three, it helps you to identify and prioritize investment opportunities. But just to come back to the operational excellence piece, because this is a really important distinction. Some gas flaring is what we call routine flaring. It happens every day, and it's because the oil field is in the middle of the desert and there's no access to market, and it's a legacy problem, and they just flare. So it happens routinely. But there's also a type of flaring called upset flaring, which is where you flare because something's gone wrong. A compressor that was re-injecting the gas doesn't work anymore, and now you've got loads of gas. What do you do? Well, you burn it. It's actually better to burn it, as I mentioned before, than to release it, not only for the environment, but from a safety point of view. So when the world can really understand how much of this is upset flaring and how much is routine, we can figure out what the right intervention is. And obviously for upset flaring, it's about operational improvement. It's about operational focus. It's about equipment reliability, maintenance, spare parts, process controls like that. And those are the easy things to do because they're just, run the asset in the possible way. But for the routine stuff, that's where you need a sort of another solution. And let me walk through what those are. Really, if I think of the two most important solutions, they are take the gas and put it in a nearby gas pipeline and send it to market. Now, sometimes you'll need to gather the gas and process it, maybe clean it up, maybe compress it and transport it. That takes investment, but it can be done. And our analysis at Capterio shows a staggering statistic that over half of all flaring is less than 20 kilometers from an existing gas pipeline. So actually,
That's not far at all.
it's not all miles away in the desert. Some of it is, but it's not inconceivably far from a pipeline. So that's option number one, stick it in a pipeline. Option number two is use it for power generation. And there's two types of power generation uses, really. One is you could use it to run your oil and gas field. And this is really wacky when you think about it, but there are plenty of oil and gas fields that use diesel to generate power to run the control systems for the oil field when there's a flare right next door. So, if you're burning diesel to generate power, well, since you're burning gas, why don't you generate power from that gas and not burn the diesel? And so that's a really good solution. And if that's not the best solution, then generate power and send it to the local power grid is often a good solution.
So We do this week have several thousand people in London. Everything from the main conference hall that you'll be speaking in, through to many sort of meetings in hotels and so on. What would you like to get out of International Energy Week, or more importantly, the people visiting International Energy Week? You are one of the keynote speakers. What would you like to achieve in the next four days or so?
Yeah, well, first of all, it's just fantastic to be here. It is always a complete buzz to be in London during International Energy Week. And, the Energy Institute puts on a brilliant show, gets the best speakers. We've got John Kerry coming this week. It's just going to be fantastic. I think I think what I would like to do is I'd like to get a laser like light. Sorry, I'd like to get I think what I'd like to get is a laser light like focus on gas flaring as an issue because it is at this nexus of energy security, decarbonisation, and cost of living. And I'd like to figure out how we up the not up the rhetoric. We got lots of rhetoric, but up the focus on delivery, because all these commitments have been made, and it's fantastic to see them, and they're important. But we need to get actual action, and so that's about taking the lofty idea to the field to figure out what has to happen. It's about unlocking red tape. It's about getting the right kind of carrots and sticks, but it's also about mobilizing money. So, I'd like to basically turn flaring as a perceived threat or liability into an opportunity and actually get people to motivate around it, inspired by the good work that is being done. And there are plenty of good stories. I've mentioned a few. There could be more, and we could go faster. And it's in everybody's interest to do so.
Before we go into our quickfire questions that we ask all of our guests throughout the year, not just during International Energy Week, how could people, especially I can imagine there's a lot of people being triggered by today's talk thinking we need to do more in our flaring. How can people work with you guys? We'll put it in the show notes, but what's the best way to get in contact, and what's a good starting point to work with Capterio?
The best way is to go to our website, capterio.com or FlareIntel.com, and take a look. Drop me a line. My email's on there. Contact us and get involved. We're always looking for partners to work with, whether they are national oil companies, whether they are international oil companies, whether they are service companies, regulators, governments, national NGOs, non-governmental organizations, or finance institutions. But as consumers, we can also begin to ask the right kind of question. Where does my gas or oil come from? How clean is it? We can begin to put pressure, and ultimately, what this does drive is it drives what's called a certified market. A differentiated product. If you can prove that your product is lower emissions than mine, I'll buy yours, not mine, for example. So there are lots of ways we can get involved, but I think just being knowledgeable, asking the right questions, challenging the status quo is just really important.
No, and I definitely think you've challenged a lot in terms of this time of showing what is possible. So we're going to get into our quick fire questions now. So the first quick fire question is: who is the most relevant person in your contact book, or probably a phone now, that you would recommend to be on a future episode of the podcast?
I would say you should ask somebody from, for example, the World Bank, or somebody from a national oil company, and I can drop you their emails to you later. If we can get more engagement from some of the leading national oil companies, this would be fantastic because they've got the most to gain and they've got the most influence as well.
The next quickfire question is: where are you investing in the energy industry?
We at Capterio, we're working globally. We're working with a whole load of global clients. Most of them are oil and gas companies who have positions in North America, South America, Africa, Asia, the Middle East. So we work with companies that have global positions. We also work, if I had a geographical focus, it would be the Middle East, North Africa. And that's strategic because there's very large volumes there, and it's also close to Europe, which is a major buyer. So we need to find solutions.
It's brilliant in International Energy Week to have someone like your company that is so international because, quite often we have people in one geography, but I think we've really dotted around the world today showing the stuff that can be possible. The next quick fire question, and I'm more referring to the British government because otherwise it wouldn't be that quick fire. What can the British government do in the next 12 months? So I'm not saying like forever, but in the next 12 months between now and International Energy Week 2026, what could they potentially do for the energy sector?
Yeah, I think the British government over multiple parliaments should get some credibility for some of the leadership they've been doing. So we've had the North Sea Transition Authority, which is our regulator here, that's really been instrumental in driving down flaring. And one way they've done that is they've upped the transparency. We've also had the British government kind of leading COP26, and there's a lot of work that continues from that. And then in terms of international partnerships, it's about deploying some of our best technology. Of course, Capterio FlareIntel is part of that, but it's also about working with British companies and others to get the right technology, the right capabilities into the countries that need it. So there's a lot that can be done, and we actually have a great position of strength to start from.
Now, the final question, you hinted on it during the last half an hour, is what would you like customers to do? Because I always feel that what people must understand with any commercial enterprise, and it doesn't matter if you're a state earning tax money or if you're a multinational trying to make your shareholder happy, is that ultimately people voting with their feet changes your behavior as a company. So just interested in what you want the customer to do.
Yes, I think the customer needs to be helped to make the choices that are most relevant for them. And if I am a customer, I'm very keen to take my electricity, for example. I make sure I buy 100% renewable electricity. And I know I do that because it's certified to be so. So if I think about the gas that I consume, and I do still consume gas, I want to have the option to buy the lowest carbon intensity gas. And for that to happen, we just need transparency in the whole supply chain. Where does gas come from? How much of it is flared and how much of it is leaked? If it's comes from LNG, how far has it come? How much boil off? So, this is where consumers can act, but they can only really act when the industry provides the right kind of information. And this is where things like certification really comes into its own. If we give the customers the tools to choose, then they can actually act.
That's a great place to end. I feel that you guys are a wonderful example of both technology, entrepreneurism, but also seeing an issue that doesn't have to stay the same way. And I think that's where I always get excited at International Energy Week is, I'm not an expert on flaring, but I've seen flares and that part of the sector. So to really speak to someone like yourself today that has shown actually how we can measure it, then how we can potentially either connect it to resources and use it as power, and then go as far as Bitcoin has been absolutely fantastic for our listeners. I urge everyone who is working out their timetable, look on the International Energy Institute's agenda for the week. You'll see Mark's name and when he's speaking, and I think you'll have a great session. So Mark, thank you very much for your time today.
Alex, thank you very much. It's a delight to speak to you. Thank you.